Picture a samurai. He stands alone on a battlefield, armor gleaming, hand resting on the hilt of his katana. He is stoic. He is honorable. He is bound by an ancient, unbreakable moral code that values loyalty above life itself. He would rather commit seppuku than face dishonor. He rejects the cowardly modern firearm in favor of the noble blade. It is an epic image. It is deeply ingrained in our culture. It is also a complete historical fabrication. That ancient samurai code you've seen in every movie, it wasn't ancient. It wasn't an unbroken tradition passed down through millennia, and it wasn't even written in Japanese. The code of Bushido, as the world understands it today, was popularized in a book written in 1899, in English, in Malvern, Pennsylvania. Let's start with what everyone believes. If you grew up watching movies, reading comics, or playing video games, you know the rules of the samurai. The katana is the soul of the warrior. Honor is absolute. Treachery is worse than death. The samurai were a class of noble knights of the East, operating on a spiritual plane far above the dirty, pragmatic warfare of the West. This image is so powerful that it has completely hijacked our understanding of Japanese history. We treat the samurai not just as soldiers, but as philosophers with swords. We believe that for centuries, they lived and died by this rigid, written code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. But if we want the truth, we have to travel back to the time when samurai actually fought wars. We need to go to the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. The year is 1467. Japan fractures into chaos. For the next 130 years, warlords known as daimyo tear the country apart in a relentless, bloody struggle for total control. This is the golden age of the samurai. This is when they forged their legacy. So, let's look at the historical record. How did these legendary warriors actually fight? First, we need to strip away the myth of the sword. The katana is a beautiful weapon. It is a masterclass in metallurgy. But on a Sengoku battlefield, it was essentially a backup weapon, a sidearm. If a samurai drew his sword in a major battle, it meant his primary weapons had failed. What were those primary weapons? The bow and the spear. The original term for the way of the samurai wasn't Bushido. It was Kuba no Michi, the way of the bow and the horse. They were mounted archers. Later, they became masters of the yari, a long spear designed to shatter cavalry charges and dominate infantry lines. War was practical. War was brutal, and the weapons reflected that reality. But what about the mindset? What about the absolute, unwavering loyalty? Here is where the official Hollywood story falls apart completely. In the Warring States period, loyalty was incredibly fluid. It was a commodity. Samurai changed sides constantly. If a lord was weak, his retainers would abandon him, betray him, or kill him. Treachery wasn't seen as a moral failing. It was seen as a tactical necessity. One of the most famous figures of this era, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who ultimately unified Japan, built his power on a foundation of brilliant, calculated betrayals. He broke alliances. He switched sides. He did exactly what he had to do to survive and win. And he wasn't the exception. He was the rule. In the brutal reality of 16th century Japan, the highest form of honor was victory. Dead men with clean consciences did not build dynasties. But perhaps the greatest myth of all is the samurai's supposed rejection of modern technology. We are told they viewed guns as cowardly, a weapon beneath a true warrior. Let's look at the evidence. In 1543, a Chinese ship blew off course and landed on the Japanese island of Tanegashima. On board were 3 Portuguese sailors. They brought something the Japanese had never seen before: matchlock muskets. If the myth of the honorable, traditional samurai were true, they would have confiscated the weapons and burned them. Instead, they bought them. Then, they reverse-engineered them. Within a decade, samurai warlords were mass-producing firearms on an industrial scale. They didn't just adopt the gun, they revolutionized its use. By 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, the warlord Oda Nobunaga deployed thousands of matchlock gunners. He used rotating volley fire. He annihilated a legendary samurai cavalry charge using pure mechanical firepower. Nobunaga didn't care about the poetry of a sword duel. He cared about obliterating his enemies, and the samurai loved it. They embraced the gun so completely that Japan quickly became one of the most heavily armed nations on the planet. They didn't see the firearm as a threat to their honor. They saw it as the ultimate tool for survival. So, we have a historical record filled with pragmatic, spear-wielding, gun-toting warlords who betrayed each other whenever it was strategically convenient. They were brilliant, they were deadly, but they were not the noble, stoic philosophers we see in modern media. They were survivors in a hyper-violent world. Which brings us to a massive, glaring question. If the samurai of the Warring States period didn't follow the strict ancient code of Bushido, where did it come from? Because the code exists. You've heard of it. The world knows it by heart, but it wasn't forged on the battlefields of the 16th century. It was engineered hundreds of years later, and the people who built it weren't even holding swords. Fast forward to the late 19th century. The year is 1868, the Meiji Restoration. Japan was facing an existential crisis. Western empires were aggressively carving up Asia. To survive, Japan realized it had to modernize. It had to industrialize. It had to become an empire itself. To build a modern nation, the new government had to destroy the old one. They abolished the samurai class entirely. They banned the wearing of swords in public. They replaced the ancient warrior elite with a modern, Western-style conscript army. The samurai, as a functioning military class, were erased from reality. But this rapid modernization created a massive psychological problem. Japan was desperately trying to prove to the West that it was civilized. They didn't want to be viewed as a backward nation ripe for colonization. They wanted a seat at the table with the British, the Americans, and the French. They needed to prove they had a deep, refined moral foundation, something that rivaled the European tradition. Enter a man named Inazo Nitobe. Nitobe was not a sword-wielding warlord. He was an agricultural economist. He was a practicing Quaker. He spent years studying and living in the United States and Germany. In 1899, while recovering from an illness in Malvern, Pennsylvania, Nitobe wrote a book. He called it Bushido, the Soul of Japan. And here's the most important detail. He did not write this book in Japanese. He wrote it in English. He wrote it specifically for a Western audience. Nitobe wanted to explain Japanese morality to his foreign friends, so he looked for a concept Westerners already understood and respected. He chose European chivalry, the romanticized knights of the Middle Ages. He took the messy, violent, pragmatic history of the samurai and completely sanitized it. He filtered it through a Victorian romantic lens. He wrote about absolute loyalty, poetic justice, stoicism, and a rigid moral framework that supposedly governed every warrior's breath. He told the West that this ancient, unbroken tradition was called Bushido. There was just one problem. When the book was eventually translated and published back in Japan, actual Japanese historians were baffled. The word Bushido barely existed in the Japanese vocabulary before 1899. It was not a common term. It was not a unified, ancient text passed down through generations. Nitobe hadn't recorded an ancient tradition. He had essentially invented a new one. He pieced together fragmented philosophies, stripped away the historical treachery, added a heavy dose of Western romanticism, and packaged it for export. He created the ultimate noble warrior archetype. And it worked. The West swallowed it whole. Bushido, the soul of Japan, became a global phenomenon. It was an absolute blockbuster. It was translated into dozens of languages. US President Theodore Roosevelt was so obsessed with the book that he bought dozens of copies and handed them out to his friends and political allies. Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, incorporated its teachings into the Scouts' moral code. The West looked at Japan and saw a nation of honorable, sword-wielding philosophers. It was exactly the exotic, mystical narrative they wanted to consume. But that is only the first layer. The buried record goes deeper, because a book written to impress foreigners was about to be turned into something terrifying. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the imperial government noticed how wildly popular the book was in the West, and they realized something profound. If the West believed this ancient, unbreakable code of absolute loyalty was real, why not make the Japanese people believe it too? And this is where the story stops being a harmless cultural misunderstanding. Japan was building a modern empire, and empires need soldiers who follow orders without question. Soldiers who do not surrender. The Japanese imperial military took Nitobe's romanticized Western-facing fiction, and they weaponized it. They injected it into the public school system. They mandated it in military training. They taught millions of young conscripts that the ultimate historical honor was to die for the emperor. They took a concept invented by a Quaker pacifist in Pennsylvania, designed to make Japan look civilized to Westerners, and they twisted it into the ideological engine of a fascist military state. Fast forward to World War II, the Pacific Theater. American and Allied soldiers faced an enemy that fought with terrifying fanaticism. They witnessed banzai charges. They saw kamikaze pilots deliberately crashing planes into warships. They encountered soldiers who refused to surrender under any circumstances, choosing suicide instead. The West was horrified. They looked at this absolute disregard for life and assumed they were fighting an ancient, mystical mindset. They believed they were fighting the ancient code of the samurai. But the men flying those planes weren't ancient warriors. They were university students. They were farm boys. They were modern conscripts caught in a modern war. And the ancient code they died for? It was state-sponsored propaganda. It was barely 40 years old. And here's the darkest irony of all. The Western powers fighting in the Pacific were battling an ideology that the West had enthusiastically helped legitimize. Teddy Roosevelt loved the book. Western intellectuals praised it. The West validated the myth. And the Japanese imperial military used that exact validation to build a death cult. This is how history gets buried. Not by hiding the truth, but by mass-producing a better story. The textbook version tells you the samurai were honorable philosophers who rejected the modern world. The myth tells you they were bound by an ancient, unbreakable moral code. The buried record shows something entirely different. Real samurai were pragmatic, ruthless, gun-toting warlords who adapted to survive. Their legacy was hijacked centuries later to sell a fabricated soul to the West, and then weaponized to send a generation of young men to their deaths. History isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes, it's written by a diplomat trying to impress a foreign audience. The next time you watch a samurai movie, or play a video game, or see a stoic warrior drawing his katana in the name of honor, remember what you are actually looking at. You aren't seeing ancient Japanese history. You are seeing a 19th century Western fever dream, mirrored back at you. Everything you just heard is documented. It's in the historical record. The truth about Sengoku warfare and the publication of Nitobe's book are established facts. The question isn't whether the real history exists. The question is, why do we prefer the illusion? If this changed how you see the samurai, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we'll keep digging.